She had been tired, more tired than she wanted to admit. The kind of tired that seeps into your bones, not just from a long week of work, but from carrying the weight of being seen, judged, and measured every single day. Her name was Naomi Carter, a black woman in her late 30s, a daughter of the South who had built a career in silence, discipline, and resilience. When she boarded that flight from Atlanta to New York, she wasn't looking for conversation, or attention, or anyone's approval. She just wanted rest. As the engines hummed and the cabin lights dimmed, Naomi leaned her head against the window and closed her eyes. She had done this countless times before. Planes had become familiar sanctuaries, places where she could disappear, into dreams without anyone, needing her to prove who she was. She didn't know that on this night. Her moment of quiet would be shattered in a way she would never forget, somewhere above the clouds. As the passengers settled in, a sudden announcement from the cockpit pierced the stillness. The captain's voice was tight, not calm and rehearsed like usual, but trembling with urgency. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. If there is any fighter pilot on board, please identify yourself immediately." The words echoed like a siren. A ripple of unease spread through the cabin. People stirred, shifted, and exchanged nervous glances. A mother pulled her child closer. A businessman lowered his newspaper, and whispers raced down the aisles. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Naomi, still groggy from sleep, opened her eyes, confused. Fighter pilot? What kind of request was that? This wasn't turbulence, wasn't a weather diversion. The captain's voice carried a weight that pressed into every passenger. Danger was near. For Naomi, the moment felt surreal. She sat in silence, letting the tension soak into her skin. People craned their necks, scanning the rows as if expecting someone, anyone, to stand up. But no one moved. Not a hand, not a word. The announcement came again, sharper this time. "If you have experience as a military fighter pilot, we urgently need your assistance in the cockpit." Panic grew. A woman in the front clutched her husband's arm. A flight attendant moved quickly down the aisle, eyes darting, searching for a savior. The sense of vulnerability was unbearable. A metal tube flying thousands of feet above the ground, filled with lives now depending on the slim chance that one among them carried the rare training to face whatever crisis was unfolding. And then quietly, Naomi felt something stir inside her, something she had worked hard to bury for years. She had been more than just a corporate consultant, more than just a weary traveler. Once, not so long ago, she had worn a uniform. She had trained under skies hotter than fire, in simulators that mimicked death, in cockpits where the sound of her own breath was the only thing that separated her from the void. Naomi Carter had been a fighter pilot in the United States Air Force, one of the few black women to ever hold that position. But she had left that life behind.
The weight of being underestimated.
The constant questioning of her competence, the subtle and sometimes not so subtle ways her presence was challenged, had worn her down. Every time she walked onto a base, she carried not just her flight bag, but the burden of proving that a black woman could belong in a world designed to keep her out. After years of service, after deployments and missions that etched themselves into her soul, she chose to step away. She told herself she was finished with that chapter. Until now. The flight attendant, pale with fear, moved row by row, asking in hushed tones, "Any military pilots here? Please, anyone?" No one answered. Naomi sat frozen, her heart hammering. She thought about the countless moments when she had been told she wasn't enough, or told she was too much, too direct, too ambitious, too black, too female. And now, in this suspended world between earth and heaven, silence reigned. She looked around at the passengers, dozens of faces twisted with fear, children clutching stuffed animals, elders whispering prayers. And she knew. She couldn't stay silent. She couldn't shrink, not when lives were at stake. With slow, deliberate movements, Naomi unbuckled her seatbelt. The click sounded louder than thunder in her ears. Heads turned as she stood, shoulders squared, gaze unflinching. She spoke, her voice steady, cutting through the murmurs. "I'm a fighter pilot. United States Air Force, retired." For a moment, the cabin stilled. People blinked, surprised, disbelieving. Some whispered, skeptical, "A black woman here, claiming to be the answer to an impossible question?" It was a moment Naomi knew too well, the doubt that followed her everywhere, the instinctive disbelief that someone like her could hold authority in the skies. The flight attendant hesitated, eyes darting as if waiting for someone else to stand, someone who fit the image they had in mind. But no one else rose. Naomi held her ground. Finally, the attendant nodded quickly, gesturing for her to follow. "Please, this way." As Naomi walked down the aisle, she felt every pair of eyes on her. Some looked with hope, others with doubt. But she had long since learned that dignity meant moving forward even when the world questioned your right to do so. She stepped into the cockpit where the captain's face was tight with strain. The co-pilot's hands trembled over the controls. Through the windshield, Naomi saw it, the glint of another aircraft in the distance, too close, too fast. A private plane off course, unresponsive to air traffic control. A collision risk. The captain turned to her, desperation raw in his voice. "Ma'am, we need help coordinating an evasive maneuver. They're not responding, and we don't have time." Naomi slipped into the jump seat, her training surging back like muscle memory. She scanned the instruments, reading altitude, heading, speed in seconds. The fear that once threatened to drown her passengers now sharpened her senses. She spoke with authority, her voice calm but commanding. "Bank left 30 degrees, now hold steady. Reduce throttle to 70%. We'll ride under their path." The captain obeyed, his movements less hesitant now that someone with combat instincts was in command. The aircraft tilted, the cabin groaning as passengers gasped. Naomi tracked the other plane's trajectory, calculating angles, predicting outcomes. For a heartbeat, it felt as though the two aircraft were destined to collide, AIE, fiery end written in the sky. But then, like two dancers narrowly missing a fatal step, the planes slipped past one another, close enough that Naomi swore she could see the rivets on its wings. A sigh of relief swept through the cockpit. The captain looked at her, eyes wide with gratitude and disbelief. You just saved us." Naomi didn't smile. Not yet. She knew what it meant to survive close calls. She also knew what it meant to walk back into a cabin where her worth might still be questioned, where people might whisper, was it really her? Could she really? But at that moment, none of that mattered. She had answered the call. She had reclaimed the sky. Back in the cabin, passengers felt the shift. The turbulence eased, the panic quieted. Naomi returned to her seat, the silence of awe heavy around her. A little black girl in the row ahead turned to look at her, eyes wide, a shy smile spreading across her face. And in that gaze, Naomi saw something more powerful than gratitude. She saw recognition. Naomi leaned back, closed her eyes again, and let the hum of the engines wash over her. She had wanted rest, but instead she had been called to remember who she was. The plane carried on through the night sky, but the air inside the cabin was heavy, thick with what had just happened, with what had almost happened. Naomi sat upright, her hands folded in her lap, her breathing steady though her heart still echoed with the adrenaline of those minutes in the cockpit. She didn't want attention. She never had. But attention found her anyway. A man across the aisle leaned toward her, his voice trembling but respectful. "Ma'am, was that really you? Did you save us?" Naomi glanced at him, saw the mixture of gratitude and disbelief in his face. She gave a small nod. "I did what I was trained to do." Whispers spread. Row by row, people leaned close to one another, their words carrying in fragments. "She was a fighter pilot?" "No way, that's incredible." "I didn't think..." Naomi heard the unfinished thoughts. She had lived them before. Didn't think someone like her? Didn't think a black woman? The little girl from earlier still peeked over her seat. Naomi smiled softly this time, letting the child see it. For that young girl, there was no disbelief, only wonder. The flight attendants approached Naomi with hushed thanks, one even squeezing her hand. Yet Naomi noticed the hesitation in their eyes, the way gratitude sat alongside doubt. Even when she had proven herself in the most undeniable way possible, the old shadows of disbelief refused to leave. She had seen those shadows. In the Air Force, too, in instructors who second-guessed her reflexes, in commanding officers who made her explain her choices twice when others were believed the first time. But Naomi also knew something else. She had endured. She had not only endured, she had excelled. And tonight, she had done what no one else could. Hours later, when the plane finally descended into New York, the passengers erupted in applause. Naomi didn't rise with it. She didn't wave or bask. She simply gathered her bag, calm and composed. Pride didn't need an audience. As they taxied to the gate, the captain came over the intercom, his voice steadier now, colored with awe. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to take a moment before we land. Tonight, this flight and everyone, On board were brought to safety by a remarkable passenger. Ms. Naomi Carter, a former United States Air Force fighter pilot, stepped forward when we needed her most. We owe her our lives. The applause came again, louder, more insistent. Passengers turned toward her, clapping, nodding, some with tears in their eyes. The little girl's mother leaned across the aisle. "Thank you," she whispered, her hand pressed to her heart. Naomi met her eyes, then looked back at the child. "Don't thank me," she said gently. "Just remember, there's no place you don't belong." It was a message meant for the girl, but also for herself. When the plane's doors opened, Naomi walked into the terminal, where the world felt startlingly ordinary. Again, fluorescent lights, tired travelers, the smell of coffee and disinfectant. Yet inside her, something had shifted. She had come face to face with the very life she thought she had left behind, and in doing so, she remembered a truth she had buried too deep. Dignity is not given. It is lived, even when others refuse to see it. Reporters would later pick up the story, though the details blurred. Some accounts marveled at the coincidence. Others questioned whether it had truly been as dire as it seemed. But what no headline could capture was the quiet weight. Naomi carried that feeling of once again having to prove, under the most extraordinary circumstances, that she was enough. Still, this time was different. For once, she did not shrink under it. She had walked the aisle, declared who she was, and no one could take that away. In the days that followed, Naomi's phone buzzed with calls from old colleagues, some with pride, some with the faint edge of surprise. "Carter," one voice said, laughing with disbelief. "Of all the planes in the sky, you had to be on that one?" But what touched Naomi most was the letter she received a week later. It was written in careful, uneven handwriting, on notebook paper with the edges torn. It came from the little girl who had been on the flight. "Dear Ms. Carter, I want to be like you when I grow up. I didn't know girls like me could fly planes. But now I do. Thank you for saving us. Thank you for showing me." Naomi held that letter for a long time, her hands trembling slightly as she read it again and again. It was a reminder that her story was not hers alone. It was a thread in a larger fabric woven into the hopes of those who came after her. That night on the plane had not only been about survival, it had been about revelation, about a world that had tried to deny her space but could not deny her skill, about reclaiming the skies, not for medals or applause, but for the dignity of being fully, unapologetically herself. Naomi Carter had gone to sleep on a plane as a tired woman carrying invisible battles. She woke to the sound of fear and rose into it, not because she sought to be a hero, but because she had never stopped being one. And as the years went on, she carried that moment with her, not as a burden, but as a beacon. A story she would one day tell her own children, her grandchildren, or perhaps whisper into the ear of another black girl who wondered if she could ever be more. The answer, Naomi knew, was yes, because she had been there. She had lived it. She had stood tall in the aisle of doubt and declared, "I am enough. I belong here. I can save us all." And for the rest of her life, those words, unspoken but undeniable, would guide her through every storm, every shadow, every sky. In the days after the flight, Naomi Carter found herself pulled into a storm she hadn't chosen. The story spread first on social media, then across television screens. Headlines danced with sensationalism. Ex-fighter pilot saves passenger jet. Former black female pilot steps in midair. The woman who kept calm at 30,000 feet. At first, Naomi ignored it. She didn't want the spotlight.
She hadn't acted for
applause or for recognition. She had acted because lives depended on it. But everywhere she turned, someone seemed to know. At the grocery store, a cashier whispered, Are you that woman?" At church, elders clasped her hands, eyes wet with pride. And yet, not all attention was kind. On certain networks, commentators smirked, asking, was it really as dramatic as people claim? Surely the captain had it under control. On online forums, strangers debated whether she had exaggerated her role. Some even doubted her credentials. A black woman fighter pilot? Come on, sounds like a PR story. Naomi had expected it. She had lived long enough to know that disbelief was the twin shadow of her existence. Even after years of service, after medals, after missions flown under the harshest skies, there were still those who could not imagine her in a cockpit. To them, her very presence was fiction. But there were others, so many others, who reached out with gratitude. Letters poured in from across the country. Veterans wrote to say they were proud to see her story told. Mothers wrote to say their daughters now believed they could fly. Black women, who had never seen themselves, represented in the military sent messages that brought tears to Naomi's eyes. You made me feel visible. She thought often of the little girl on the plane, the one who had smiled at her with wide-eyed wonder. Naomi kept the letter she had received from her pinned above her desk. Whenever doubt crept in, whenever cynicism whispered that change was impossible, she looked at that letter and remembered. It wasn't about convincing the world. It was about planting a seed in even one heart. Still, the attention forced her to reckon with something she had avoided. For years after leaving the Air Force, Naomi had buried her identity as a pilot. It was too painful, too heavy with memories of proving herself over and over, of fighting not just gravity but prejudice. She had told herself she was done with that chapter. But the truth was, she had only locked it away. The night of the flight had unlocked it again. And now she wondered if she owed it not just to herself but to the next generation to bring that part of her life into the light. One evening, as autumn leaves gathered outside her apartment window, Naomi received a call from a university. The dean of aviation studies asked her to speak to their students, especially their women, especially their black students, about her journey. At first, she hesitated. She didn't like being on stages. She didn't like the feeling of being asked to represent an entire community with every word. But then she thought of the little girl, of the letter, of all the faces that would never forget the night she stood up in the aisle and said, "I'm a fighter pilot." So she said yes. When the day came, Naomi stood before a crowded lecture hall. Rows of students sat leaning forward, eyes fixed on her. Some wore uniforms of the ROTC, others came in civilian clothes. But in all of them, she saw hunger, the hunger to know if the skies were truly open to them. Naomi told them the truth. Not the polished, sugar-coated version. She told them about the discrimination, the doubts, the way she was made to repeat her competence over and over until her bones ached from it. She told them about nights alone, about near misses that left her trembling, about the exhaustion of being both a pilot and a proof. But she also told them about the power of persistence, about how no matter how many times she was doubted, she never doubted herself. Dignity, she said, her voice steady, is not given by rank, or medals or applause. Dignity is what you carry when the world questions your worth. It's standing tall when they expect you to shrink. It's knowing that even if you are the only one, especially if you are the only one, you still belong. The room was silent. Some students had tears in their eyes. One young woman raised her hand, her voice trembling as she asked, "Miss Carter, how did you keep going? When it felt like everyone was against you, how did you stay?" Naomi paused, remembering the long nights, the moments she almost quit. And then she answered, "Because I knew that every time I stayed, I was making it just a little easier for the next one to walk through the door. I stayed for myself, yes, but also for you." Applause erupted, not the polite kind, but the kind that shakes a room. Naomi felt it wash over her, not as validation, but as connection. For the first time in years, she didn't feel alone in her story. After that day, Naomi found herself speaking more often, at schools, at community centers, at conferences where people wanted to hear, not just about aviation, but about resilience. She told her story not for fame, not to relive her near miss in the sky, but to remind people of the truth she had lived. The courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to rise anyway. Every so often, though, she still boarded planes as a passenger. Every time she would glance out the window at the clouds, at the endless blue stretching beyond the horizon. And every time she remembered that night, the captain's trembling voice, the silence of disbelief, the moment she rose to claim her place. Naomi Carter had once thought she was done with the sky. But the sky, it seemed, was not done with her. It had called her back not to fly alone, but to remind the world that there was room for her, and for every young, black girl who dared to dream of wings. And though she never sought the title of hero, Naomi came to understand that being one wasn't about saving the world. It was about showing up when the world doubted you most, and leaving behind a truth no one could erase. She had once been a fighter pilot. She would always be a fighter pilot. And on that night, high above the earth, she had fought again, not just for survival, but for dignity. And she had won. Naomi Carter never set out to be a symbol. She had only wanted to rest, to live quietly, to carry the memories of her service like old medals tucked in a drawer. But the world had chosen otherwise. That night on the plane had not only saved lives, It had unearthed a story larger than herself. And now wherever she went, people wanted to hear it. At first, Naomi worried about becoming trapped in her own narrative. She did not want to be remembered only as the woman who once saved a flight. She wanted people to see the years before, the grind of training, the relentless discipline, the quiet courage of being one of the first. Black women in cockpits built by men who never imagined her sitting there. So when she spoke, she told the whole truth. She spoke about how systems can crush you with their silence, about the way discrimination rarely arrives as a shout, but as a whisper, a delayed promotion, an overlooked recommendation, a raised eyebrow that forces you to prove yourself twice over. She spoke about the loneliness of being the only one in the room, and the strength it takes to keep showing up anyway. Her honesty resonated. Universities invited her back. Community organizations asked her to mentor their youth. Aviation companies reached out, hoping her story could help them recruit a more diverse generation of pilots. Naomi didn't say yes to everyone. She valued her peace, but she chose carefully, giving her time where it mattered most. One day, she received an invitation from the Air Force itself. They wanted her to speak at an academy graduation, standing before hundreds of cadets who were about to step into the same world she once navigated. Naomi hesitated. The Air Force had been both her proving ground and her battlefield. She had loved flying, but she had also carried scars from her service. Was she ready to face it again? After days of reflection, she decided she was. Not for herself, but for those cadets who needed to see her standing tall, unapologetic, unbroken. On the day of the ceremony, Naomi walked onto the stage in a tailored suit. The sun blazed against the silver of the jets lined neatly in the distance. Rows of cadets snapped to attention. For a moment, she felt the weight of years pressing down on her, the training runs, the near misses, the disbelief she endured. And then she spoke. "I see in you what I once saw in myself," she began, her voice carrying over the field. "The hunger to rise, to test your limits, to hold the sky in your hands. But let me tell you this, flying is not only about skill. It is about identity. It will challenge not only your reflexes, but your sense of self. The world will question you. Some of you, because of your race, your gender, your background, will be questioned more than others. And in those moments, your wings will feel heavier than anyone else's." She paused, letting her words settle. "But you must carry them. You must carry them not only for yourself, but for the ones who will come after you. Because every time you rise, you carve a path a little clearer for someone else." When she finished, the applause was thunderous. Later, cadets lined up to speak to her, to shake her hand, to tell her what her words meant. A young black man whispered, "I didn't think people like us could stand here. Now I know we can." A Latina cadet hugged her with tears in her eyes. "Thank you for not hiding your story," she said. Naomi returned home that night exhausted but renewed. She realized then that her story was no longer just hers. It had become a torch she carried, a flame she could pass on to others. In the years that followed, Naomi helped launch a foundation dedicated to supporting women and minorities in aviation. They provided scholarships, mentorship, and exposure to children who had never even been inside an airport. Naomi spent weekends visiting schools, standing in gymnasiums filled with curious faces, telling them about the magic of flight. "Look up," she would say, pointing to the sky. "That space belongs to you too." Her foundation grew. Former pilots joined. Companies donated. Slowly, the numbers began to change. More women enrolled in flight training. More young black students pursued aviation degrees. The impact wasn't immediate, but it was real. Of course, Naomi still faced critics. Some accused her of exaggerating the discrimination she endured. Others dismissed her efforts as symbolic, claiming real change came only from policy, not inspiration. Naomi didn't argue with them. She knew the truth. Policy could open doors, but only courage could make people walk through them. One evening, years after the flight, Naomi sat in her living room with her closest friends. The letter from the little girl on the plane still hung on her wall, now framed. That girl was older now, in college, studying aerospace engineering. She had written Naomi again years later. "I still remember you. You're why I believe I can do this." Naomi read that letter aloud to her friends. Her voice cracked, and for once she let the tears fall. "This," she said softly, "this is why it mattered." They raised their glasses to her, to the journey, to the night when fatigue gave way to courage and changed countless lives. Naomi Carter was not a household name in every corner of the world, but she didn't need to be. Her story had already reached where it needed to go. into the hearts of those who doubted themselves, those who wondered if they belonged, those who needed proof that dignity could not be denied forever. And as she aged, her legacy grew not in headlines but in lives touched, in doors opened, in skies filled with new voices. Naomi never forgot the captain's desperate call that woke her from sleep. "Any fighter pilot on board?" It had been both a question and a challenge. Her answer had been simple, unshakable. "Yes, I am here." And with those words, she had not only saved a flight, she had saved a piece of the future, proving that sometimes the most powerful battles are not fought with missiles or machines, but with the courage to stand tall when the world least expects you to. Years passed. The story of Naomi, Carter's night on that flight, became one of those tales that people shared in classrooms, in interviews, even in sermons about courage. But what gave it strength was not just the moment in the sky, it was what came after. Naomi had refused to let that single incident define her. Instead, she used it as a foundation to build something lasting. By now, Naomi's foundation for women and minorities in aviation had grown beyond what she first imagined. It began with scholarships, yes, but quickly expanded into mentorship networks, internships, and partnerships with airlines. She insisted that it was not enough to open doors. Students needed to feel supported after they walked through them. Her approach was holistic. She arranged mental health, support for young pilots who struggled under the invisible pressure of being the only one in their class. She invited retired aviators to sit with students, to share not just the glory of flying but the struggles of navigating bias. She organized conferences where children could climb into real cockpits, touching controls that once seemed untouchable. For many, those moments were life-changing. Naomi often said, "Dreams don't grow in silence. They grow when someone tells you, you belong here." Still, she carried her share of weariness. Every recognition, every award came with a subtle edge. Too often, she was introduced not as Naomi Carter, pilot and leader, but as the black woman who once saved a plane. The simplification frustrated her. She was proud of that night, but she was more than it. She wanted people to see her whole life, not just the snapshot that fit a headline. Yet she also knew this. Even if they only remembered her for that night, the seed was planted. That was enough. One winter, Naomi received an invitation she could not have imagined years earlier. Congress wanted her to testify during hearings on diversity and inclusion in aviation. For decades, numbers had barely moved. Black pilots remained an exception, women even rarer. Naomi walked into the chamber with calm composure, wearing a navy blue suit that carried echoes of her old uniform. Cameras flashed, reporters scribbled, but Naomi kept her eyes steady on the committee. When asked to speak, she didn't give statistics. She gave stories. She told them about being the only black woman in her squadron, about the silence that followed her into briefing rooms, about the countless times she was asked to prove herself in ways her peers were not. She told them about the girl on the plane, about the letter on her wall, about how one act of courage could inspire generations, but how inspiration alone could not dismantle barriers. "We need more than symbols," Naomi said firmly. "We need systems that recognize talent without prejudice, that nurture rather than question, that build confidence instead of crushing it." Her words carried weight. That hearing sparked new policies. Funding for flight schools that served underrepresented communities, mentorship pipelines that paired cadets with senior pilots who once felt the same isolation. Change came slowly, as it always did, but it came. Naomi never claimed credit. She told those close to her that all she did was tell the truth. But truth in her voice had power. As the years stretched into decades, Naomi grew older. The sharp edges of memory softened, though she still carried the deep pride of having flown, of having served, of having saved. Her body slowed, but her mind remained sharp, her voice steady. She often sat by her window in the evenings, watching the streaks of departing planes cutting through the sky. Each one was a reminder that she had left something behind, not a headline, not just a story, but a path. Sometimes former students visited her, now pilots themselves, their uniforms crisp, their voices full of gratitude. They would tell her how they thought of her when they sat in cockpits, how they carried her words into every flight. "There's no place you don't belong." Naomi always smiled at that, her eyes glistening. She knew those words mattered more than anything. One day that little girl from the plane, now a grown woman, came to see her. She was no longer a child with wide eyes, but a confident young pilot in her own right. She carried wings on her chest and a story in her smile. "Ms. Carter," she said softly, hugging her, "I made it. I'm flying now. Because of you." Naomi held her tightly, her heart swelling with a pride beyond words. In that embrace, the circle was complete. What began as a desperate announcement in the sky had become a legacy, carried forward in flesh and blood, in dreams and determination. Naomi didn't need monuments. She didn't need songs written in her honor. She had something greater, proof that her life had broken barriers for others, that her courage had rewritten what was possible. As she sat alone that evening, Naomi whispered a prayer of gratitude. Gratitude for her parents who taught her resilience. Gratitude for the Air Force which tested her. Gratitude even for the skeptics who pushed her to sharpen her will. And gratitude above all for the sky, that vast, unending canvas that had always been both her battleground and her home. In the end, Naomi Carter's life was not about a single night on a plane. It was about a lifetime of standing tall in places where others expected her to kneel. It was about dignity lived, justice pursued, and courage sustained long after the applause had faded. And when she was remembered, it was not only as a woman who saved lives one night above the clouds. She was remembered as someone who gave wings to others, who proved that history bends not only through grand revolutions, but through quiet acts of defiance and unwavering belief. The world would always ask, any fighter pilot on board? And somewhere, in countless cockpits, voices would rise because of her. Yes, I am here. The story of Naomi Carter does not end with her. It never truly belonged to her alone. It belongs to every black child who sat by a window and wondered if the world had a place for them. It belongs to every woman who carried dreams too heavy for a society that told her she was too small. It belongs to all who were told no but dared to live as if yes was inevitable. Naomi Carter became more than a pilot. She became a mirror in which a generation could see its reflection with clarity, dignity, and pride. She showed that history is not only written by those with pens in marble halls, but also by ordinary people who rise in extraordinary moments. A moment on a plane, a voice over the intercom, a decision to stand when silence would have been safer. These are the building blocks of legacy. When people remember her, they do not just recall the technical skill it took to land an aircraft. They remember the calm in her voice, the steadiness in her hands, the unshakable presence that told terrified passengers that their lives mattered. She was not only a rescuer that night. She was proof of a truth too long denied, that brilliance. Courage and leadership know no color and no gender. Her name traveled far. Universities studied her as an example of resilience under pressure. Advocacy groups spoke her name in the same breath as Rosa Parks, Mae Jemison, and other women who rewrote what was possible. And in countless living rooms, parents whispered her story to their children, not as legend, but as a roadmap. This is who you can be. This is what you can do. Naomi herself resisted the crown of heroism. She never chased fame, never sought to be the centerpiece of articles or awards. Her life was a quiet rebellion against invisibility, not a performance. Yet history has a way of placing crowns on heads that never ask for them. And so she became a symbol. Symbols, though, are fragile if they stand alone. Naomi knew this. That is why she built institutions. She mentored. She advocated. She fought not for her own name, but for the names yet unspoken, for the pilots who had not yet touched a cockpit, for the girls who still sketched airplanes and notebooks while doubting if they would ever see the inside of one. Her story, in the end, was not about flying machines. It was about human dignity, about the right to be seen, to be trusted, to be honored for what one carries inside. And perhaps that is why her memory carries such weight. Because Naomi Carter reminds us of something fundamental. That discrimination, no matter how deep its roots, cannot ground a soul determined to rise. In later years, when she walked through airports, sometimes strangers would approach her shyly. Some knew her from articles, others only through whispers. They would say, "You're Naomi Carter, aren't you?" "Thank you." And every time, Naomi would smile gently, not with pride in herself, but with joy that the story lived on in the hearts of those who needed it. She became, in her quiet way, an anchor, a reminder that Black life, too often dismissed or devalued, is not only about survival, but about brilliance, mastery, and excellence. That Black women, so often silenced, carry the ability not only to change history, but to save lives, sometimes thousands at once. As her hair turned silver, Naomi often spoke with students about legacy. "Don't chase applause," she told them. "Chase purpose. Applause fades. Purpose builds empires inside the soul." When Naomi Carter passed into memory, the news rippled across the nation. Tributes came from every corner. Pilots she had trained, activists who had drawn strength from her, passengers who had once been saved by her steady hands. Air traffic control towers in several cities dimmed their lights in her honor, and one airline named a scholarship after her, ensuring that every year a young black woman would be given wings because she once dared to hold them. But perhaps the most moving tribute came not from institutions, but from the skies themselves. Pilots across the country performed what is known as a missing man formation, a maneuver usually reserved for fallen heroes. One jet peeled away, climbing toward the heavens, leaving a gap in the formation that symbolized absence, but also eternity. In that moment, every eye lifted upward, and many whispered the same thought: Naomi Carter is still flying. Her legacy reminds us that dignity is not granted, it is claimed. That justice is not a gift, it is earned and demanded. That courage is not the absence of fear, it is the act of moving forward despite it. So today, when a child boards a plane and looks into the cockpit, seeing a face they did not expect, perhaps a black woman, calm and confident at the controls, they are witnessing Naomi Carter's dream fulfilled. They may not know her name. They may not know the night when terror turned into triumph, but they are living in the world she helped shape. And that is the essence of legacy. To live so fully, so courageously that your life outlives you. Naomi Carter's story closes not in silence, but in continuation. For every barrier she broke, another voice now rises. For every moment she endured, another generation is freed. The world will always face storms. Planes will always hit turbulence. Life will always test the limits of human endurance. But as long as there are voices like Naomi Carter's, steady, calm, unyielding, we will find our way through. The captain's call will always echo. Is there any fighter pilot on board? And because of Naomi Carter, the answer will never again be in doubt. Yes, she was here. And because of her, others will always be. The night the sky tested her, Naomi Carter answered. Not with fear, not with doubt, but with the quiet certainty of a woman who had fought her whole life to be seen. And though the engines of that aircraft eventually cooled, though the headlines faded and the applause quieted, her act became eternal because courage, once given, multiplies in others. It is easy to forget that history is not only made in parliaments, in protests, or on grand stages. Sometimes it is made in the small space between a question and an answer. Is there any fighter pilot on board? That question carried with it centuries of doubt, of disbelief, of systems designed to whisper that black women were never enough. And Naomi Carter's answer was not just the steady control of an aircraft. It was a declaration. To the world, I am here. I always have been. She became proof that dignity is not requested, it is lived. She showed that justice is not only fought in courtrooms or campaigns, but also in moments where one life standing firm shifts perception for millions. And she embodied the truth that the resilience of black women has never been a quiet footnote in history. It is the very engine that keeps history moving forward. When Naomi Carter finally left this world, people did not simply mourn. They remembered. They retold. They passed her story from lips to ears, from classrooms to pulpits, from families to strangers. Because Naomi was not just a woman who once landed a plane, she was a bridge between what was and what could be. In schools, her story became required reading. Teachers asked students not only to analyze what she did, but to reflect on what it meant. About courage, about visibility, about the right to take space in places once denied. Children wrote essays titled, Because of Naomi, I Believe I Can. And for those children, her legacy was not an abstract history lesson. It was a mirror. In airports, portraits of her hung in quiet corners. Travelers passing by would stop, pause, and read. Some smiled, some wiped away tears. Strangers who had never met her felt as though they had, because her story spoke to the universal hunger for recognition, for fairness, for the possibility of overcoming. The airlines, often criticized for indifference, did something rare. They created a program in her honor. Every year, on the anniversary of that fateful flight, young cadets, especially those from backgrounds long ignored, were invited to fly with senior captains, symbolizing mentorship, continuity, and hope. Naomi's name became a touchstone for equity not just in aviation, but in every industry where barriers remained. Yet beyond the programs, beyond the portraits, Naomi's greatest legacy lived in the intangible, the ripple effect of dignity. A mother telling her daughter, you can. A young man of color stepping into an interview with his head held higher. A community that learned through her that excellence belongs to all. Her story closed with the quiet grace of a life well lived. No grand spectacle, no final applause, just the steady truth of a woman who had given all she could, and in doing so, had given more than she would ever know. And so, when we think of Naomi Carter, we do not think only of one night above the clouds. We think of the little girl who once believed the sky was closed to her. We think of the cadet who endured whispers and doubt but pressed forward anyway. We think of the woman who sat in a cockpit, hands steady on controls, and reminded the world that brilliance wears many faces. Her journey was a map, her courage a compass, her life a message that justice, dignity, and pride are not lofty ideals but living truths, carried in flesh and blood, proven in moments of fire. And now, her name joins the constellation of those who changed history not through force, but through presence. Rosa Parks sat. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke. Maya Angelou wrote, Naomi Carter flew. The world will continue to ask its fearful questions in planes, in boardrooms, in classrooms, in communities. Is there anyone here who can lead us through this storm? And because of Naomi, countless voices that once might have been silenced, will answer, yes, I am here. The sky, once thought unreachable, now holds their names, and Naomi Carter forever flies with them.